The storm was coming long before anyone saw it. Clouds bunched low over the town of Elder Spring, dark and heavy, like a promise of trouble yet to fall. Rain whispered in the distance, wind gnawed at the corners of empty streets, and the world smelled of wet pine and iron. It was late October, and the town wore it like a soaked coat. Windows shuddered against the sky's gray weight, and the alleys waited in silence, almost holding their breath. Behind Maynard's diner, two small shadows crept through the gloom. Issa and Ivy Monroe, 8-year-old twins, hunched and careful, barely more than part of the darkness. They were alike in every way except for their voices. Issa's voice carried the life of both sisters. Ivy spoke only when she had no choice. Weeks of wandering had dulled their skin, tied their honey-blonde hair in fraying ponytails, and left them hungry, thirsty, and scared. Their mother had died 6 weeks ago, quietly in her sleep, and no one had come for them. Their father, a Marine, had disappeared years before. So the girls had learned to move alone, to survive on scraps and stolen kindness. That evening, Issa led Ivy behind the diner. Sometimes the cook left food near the bins, biscuits cold, fries soggy, scraps nobody wanted. But tonight, there was nothing but the sour smell of old grease. Hunger growled low between them. "I'll check the other side," Issa whispered, her voice brittle, cracking but refusing to break. Ivy followed without question, her small hand clutching Issa's as they moved like ghosts. The wind arrived suddenly, tossing Issa's hair across her eyes. A low, rolling moan echoed through the trees beyond the dumpsters, a sound that made the girls freeze. The sky darkened further, a strange greenish shade that made adults shutter windows and dogs whine. Ivy's grip tightened. "We should go." "Back," she whispered, voice trembling. "There's nowhere to go back to," Issa replied softly, though her tone held a thread of hope. They reached the edge of the tree line, hoping to find shelter beneath a giant oak, its roots bending like old bones. But the sky had other plans. Rain pelted them in sharp, stinging bursts. Thunder split the air, so close it seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Then came the sound that would change everything, a long, painful groan of wood bending. The tree fell. Issa screamed as splintered bark and limbs smashed down, crushing the ground beneath them. Ivy didn't scream. Her sobs were quiet, soundless, lost in the storm. Issa's chest and back were pinned first, her head bleeding as rain mixed with the coppery taste of blood. She reached for Ivy, fingers trembling, refusing to let go. Miles away, Sawyer Whitlock sat alone in his garage. Rain tapped a steady rhythm on the roof, like cold fingers drumming on a coffin lid. He smelled cedar, oil, and memory. At 51, Sawyer carried the quiet weight of grief without complaint. His hair had silvered around the edges, his shoulders stooped slightly with years of silent loss. He sifted through a wooden box labeled June, his daughter, who had died 5 years ago at 10 years old. Paper snowflakes, a broken walkie-talkie, a crumpled drawing. She had made it all. One picture showed a girl holding a dog under a tree that stretched across the page. The dog looked like Shadow, his German shepherd. Shadow, retired now, lay curled in the corner. But as the storm swelled outside, the dog rose, ears alert, and barked sharply, once, twice. Sawyer frowned. "It's just thunder, boy." Shadow growled, low and deliberate, then sprinted from the garage. Sawyer swore and followed, jacket in hand. In the woods, Issa coughed, blood foaming at her lips. Ivy rasped, eyes wide. "Don't sleep," Issa begged. Ivy tried to smile, but the pain was louder than courage. Shadow burst through the rain-soaked trees like a phantom, nose to the ground, then howled. Sawyer arrived seconds later, soaked to the bone, flashlight slicing through the dark. Two small figures lay beneath the shattered oak. One moved weakly, The other barely breathed. "Jesus," Sawyer whispered. He dropped to his knees, lifting the heavy branch with all his strength. Shadow pressed close to Ivy, warming her shivering body. Isa's hand closed around the dog's fur, and this time, she didn't let go. Rain battered the earth. Thunder, rolling over the hills, and Sawyer held Isa in his arms. Ivy's leg was pinned cruelly beneath another limb, eyes glassy, lips trembling. Shadow stayed pressed against her, calm and steady. "Hold on, sweetheart. Hold on," Sawyer murmured. Radioing dispatch urgently. Ambulance en route. 15 minutes felt like hours. He wrapped Isa's bleeding temple, spoke softly to Ivy, promising her she was safe, that they were no longer alone. When the ambulance finally arrived, its lights flickered through the storm, distant stars against the night. EMTs moved quickly, lifting Ivy first, calm and efficient, then tending Isa. Sawyer climbed into the back, Shadow leaping beside him without hesitation. Rain drummed against the ambulance, sirens cutting through the storm, and Isa murmured something that might have been Ivy's name. At Elder Spring General Hospital, flickering lights shone on peeling paint and floors smelling of antiseptic and stale coffee. Waiting in the ER entrance was Dr. Elroy Hampton, 72, wiry, with pale blue eyes that had once softened children, but now often startled adults. He had run the town's only free clinic for 17 years, surviving funding, cuts and near closures, always refusing to charge a cent for families, without insurance. Earlier that evening, he'd sat at his desk filling out paperwork he never thought he'd sign. A formal petition to shutter his clinic, his last act of surrender. Donations had dried, volunteers had gone, no grants had come. But when the doors burst open and he saw those girls on the gurneys, bleeding, broken, and small, something in him flared back to life. He stepped forward. "What do we have?" Melody recited Isa's vitals while Thomas transferred Ivy to a second room. Sawyer stood off to the side, wet to the bone. Shadow sitting beside him like a soaked statue. Dr. Hampton didn't pause. "Get me a scan," on the older twin's head. "She's semi-responsive. I'll need x-rays on the other. Don't wait. Move." The nurses jumped to it. Shadow didn't move until Ivy disappeared behind the curtain. Then he paced once, circled, and lay back down. Dr. Hampton turned to Sawyer. "You found them?" "Yes, sir." "Where?" "North Pine Trail. They were trying to take cover." Tree came down. "They homeless?" "I think so. No ID. No adult in sight." The old doctor rubbed his forehead. "How old?" 8. Twins. Dr. Hampton sighed. "Figures." He glanced at the form still folded in his coat pocket. Then he tore it in half. That night, the hospital lights burned longer than usual. Dr. Hampton stayed past shift change. He called in favors from the local university for pediatric consults. He reopened 2 unused recovery rooms, and somewhere between hour 3 and hour 6, he sat beside Ivy and said, "You're not leaving this world on my watch, little girl. Not while I'm still breathing." Meanwhile, Sawyer sat in the corner of the waiting room, soaked clothes long since clinging to him, watching raindrops snake down the glass like time leans bending. He held the crayon drawing in his hands. The one from June's box, the girl and the dog. The tree. It had always haunted him, but now it made a terrible sort of sense. The eyes in the drawing, they were Isa's eyes. Shadow rested his head on Sawyer's boot, sighing once, as if agreeing with a truth only dogs can understand. And outside, the storm finally began to pass. The dawn crept in slowly through the hospital blinds, filtering in long, pale streaks that stretched across linoleum floors and the faded arms of waiting room chairs. Outside, the storm had passed, but the world still held its breath. Leaves littered the parking lot in haphazard spirals, and the scent of rain clung to everything like memory. Inside room 208 of Elder Spring General, Isla Monroe stirred beneath thin hospital sheets, her breath coming in shallow staccato bursts. The machines beside her blinked softly. A heart monitor pulsed its steady rhythm, and the IV beside it delivered slow drips of fluid into her bruised arm. Her head was bandaged, and her cheek bore a shallow cut that had scabbed overnight. No longer bleeding, but still raw. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, not frightened. Yet, she tried to sit up, but a throb behind her eyes forced her back down. She turned her head. Shadow lay curled at the foot of her bed, his dark fur matted in places from the night before. He had not left her side since their arrival. His ears twitched as he sensed her wakefulness, and his eyes opened, dark and watchful. He didn't move toward her. He waited, letting her decide. Shadow. She croaked, the word more air than voice. The dog rose and padded silently to her side, resting his chin on the edge of the bed. His presence, immense yet gentle, sent a wave of something warm through Isa's chest. She reached out and touched his head, her fingers trembling. He didn't move. He simply looked up at her, eyes steady, as if to say, "I found you. You're not alone now." The door creaked open. Sawyer Whitlock stepped in, his hair damp from a recent shower, now changed into a fresh uniform. There were lines beneath his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday, but his voice was calm. "Morning, kid," he said softly. "You're safe. You're in a hospital." I flinched at his voice and shrank back into the bed. Her hand stayed on Shadow. "It's all right," he added, kneeling to her level. "I'm the one who found you. Shadow, too." Her gaze stayed locked on the dog. "Where's Ivy?" she asked, barely audible. "She's next door," Sawyer answered. "She's still sleeping, but she's stable. The doctors are taking good care of her." The girl blinked at him, suspicious but not hostile. A knock sounded at the doorframe. A nurse entered. A young woman named Lauren Fisk, short with chestnut hair, pulled into a tight bun. She had a gentle face and a kindness that came naturally to her, not rehearsed like some. Her uniform sleeves were rolled at the elbow, revealing faded ink from an old tattoo on her forearm. A lavender sprig, delicate and full of story. "Vitals look steady," Lauren said, checking Isla's monitor. "You've got a little fever, but nothing scary. You're a strong one, huh?" Isa didn't answer. Her fingers twitched in Shadow's fur. "I'll bring some food in a bit, real food. And someone special's bringing something even better." Sawyer raised a brow. "Georgia?" Lawrence smiled. "Who else bakes before sunrise around here?" Georgia Lynn had always been part of Elder Spring, though the town rarely acknowledged it out loud. She owned a small bakery on Main, Georgia's Hearth, where cinnamon lived in the walls and flour danced on sunlight beams every morning. She was in her early 60s, taloned willow thin, with long white-streaked hair she usually wore in a braid, down her back. Her eyes were sharp, not from age, but from life. She didn't smile much, not anymore, but when she did, it was the kind that made you pause. Georgia had lost her daughter, Claire, in a car crash 6 years ago. Claire had been 9. Since then, Georgia rarely spoke of her, rarely let anyone in past the scent of yeast and the clatter of trays in her shop. She lived alone in a blue house on Birch Street with lace curtains that never opened, but this morning something compelled her to wake early, even earlier than usual. She pulled out an old tin box from the top shelf of her pantry, blew off the dust, and opened it slowly. Inside were small keepsakes. Claire's favorite marble, a note scrolled in purple crayon that read, "I love you more than toast," and a pair of tiny woolen shoes. Georgia had knitted them herself. They were soft, yellow, with a little button on each ankle. She had never given them away, never donated them, never burned them like she once thought she would. Now, for some reason she couldn't name, She placed them on the windowsill and left them there. Then she baked. An hour later, Georgia walked into Elder Spring General carrying a woven basket. It was lined with linen and filled with soft cinnamon rolls, still warm, and a small jar of apple butter. She said nothing as she handed them to Lauren at the nurse's station. "For the girl," she said simply, then turned to leave. Lauren caught her arm. "Come in with me." Georgia hesitated. "They're scared," Lauren added. "And you? You bring comfort." Georgia didn't reply, but she followed. When she stepped into room 208, the air shifted, not from anything anyone said, but from the smell. Cinnamon and butter and warmth. Issa's eyes widened. Her face changed, not to joy, but something deeper, something remembered. "My mom used to smell like that," she whispered. Georgia blinked, caught off guard. "I remember it when she hugged us, even when she was tired. Cinnamon and soft things." Sawyer stepped back. Georgia approached slowly, cautious not to crowd. Issa reached out for the basket. Georgia passed it to her gently. "There's no nuts," Georgia said, her voice rough from disuse. "And the apple butter's sweet, not sour." Issa nodded, holding the jar like treasure. Her eyes welled. Georgia turned and left without, waiting for a thank you. Later that evening, back in her house, Georgia returned to the kitchen. She glanced at the window where the little yellow shoes sat. For the first time in 6 years, she didn't feel like hiding them. She left them there as dusk fell, casting shadows long and quiet across the hardwood floor. And in the hospital, Issa fell, asleep, holding Shadow's ear with one hand and the edge of George's linen cloth with the other. The sun over Elder Spring in late October rarely brought warmth, only light. It streamed through brittle yellow leaves and glinted off puddles left by the storm, but it could not erase the chill that clung to the town like second skin. Inside room 208, however, a quiet transformation had begun. Issa Monroe had laughed. It wasn't a full laugh. It was small, startled out of her like a hiccup, when Shadow, trying to sit on the narrow hospital chair, tipped it backward with a thump and flailed inelegantly to regain his balance. The absurdity of it cracked the thin layer of silence she had wrapped herself in, and a choked giggle slipped free before she could stop it. Georgia Lynn, who had just arrived with a new basket of oatmeal scones, paused in the doorway, her eyes softening just slightly at the sound. Shadow stood up, again with a wounded sword of pride, shook himself, and padded over to Ida's bed as if to pretend nothing had happened. That night, Georgia stayed longer than usual. She took a seat by the window, not too close, and read a book aloud in a calm, steady tone, one she hadn't used in years, not since bedtime stopped meaning anything to her. The book was Charlotte's Web, one of Claire's old favorites. Issa didn't follow every word, but she listened to the voice. It wasn't about the story. It was about the steadiness of it. Sawyer Whitlock sat across the hall, sipping lukewarm coffee and scrolling through case files on a borrowed laptop. The hospital's Wi-Fi was slow, but he was used to things that took time. The Monroe girls had no recent school records, no official guardianship filings, no medical history past 3 years old, and the mother, Dahlia Monroe, haddied without documentation. A neighbor in Oak River, 70 miles south, had filed a welfare concern months ago, but no follow-up had ever occurred. Sawyer read the note 3 times. Dahlia, a former librarian, had reportedly been ill. Long-term fatigue, dizzy spells, but no diagnosis on file. Medical debt had driven her off the grid. No health insurance, no emergency contacts. The father, Grant Monroe, had served with the U.S. Marines and was listed as MIA in Kandahar province. 2 years prior, presumed dead. No other family could be found. They were, as far as the system was concerned, ghosts. Dr. Elroy Hampton appeared beside him without sound. a skill honed from decades of midnight rounds. He held a clipboard and an air of tired certainty. I-4 went in smoothly. No sign of infection. The younger one's fever's responding to fluids and rest, he said. The older stable, but we'll keep her 2 more nights to monitor for any post-concussive symptoms. Sawyer nodded. Thanks, Doc. You're digging, Hampton said, peering over his glasses. Find anything useful? They've got no one. They've got each other. Hampton replied, sometimes that's enough. He paused, then added, You noticed the dog? Sawyer raised a brow. Shadow. I've worked here 32 years, Deputy. I've seen therapy dogs, canines, cats that snuck in from alleys, once even a parrot someone swore helped their migraines. But that dog, he knows things. Sawyer tilted his head, listening. When the younger one spiked a fever last night. Shadow pawed at Georgia's arm until she got up. Hampton continued. She didn't know why, but followed him to the girls' room. We caught the temperature just before it turned dangerous. He scribbled something on the chart. Dogs don't fake empathy, he muttered. Wish I could say the same for people. In room 209, Ivy Monroe stirred in her sleep, her forehead damp but cooling. Shadow had returned to her door, lying just inside, ears twitching whenever her breath changed rhythm. Georgia stepped in quietly, saw him there, and sat down without a word. She didn't knit. She didn't hum lullabies, but she stayed. She was learning that presence could be louder than comfort. Later that afternoon, Sawyer returned with files. He brought them to Georgia, who had just brought in banana muffins wrapped in wax paper. She's not allergic to bananas, is she? Georgia asked, fussing with the ribbon. Sawyer shook his head. Number. But she probably hasn't had anything that ripe in a year. He paused, then handed her the folder. This is everything I found. Father's MIA, mother's dead. No extended family. If I file this with CPS today, they'll end up in state custody by Thursday. Georgia opened the folder and scanned it silently. When she looked up, her eyes were flint. What's the alternative? Sawyer shrugged. Temporary custody through a community petition. If someone steps forward, someone who lives here, someone the court would trust. Her fingers twitched. I run a bakery, not a home. I've seen your home, he said. It's warm, quiet, has a window with shoes waiting. That caught her breath. She looked away. You think I could do it after all these years? He didn't answer right away. Then gently, I think no one else will try. Georgia stood in silence for a long time. Then she turned and left, not out of dismissal, but because decisions that change the shape of grief must be made in motion. That night, as Ida lay curled against Shadow's flank, she whispered, He snores louder than a person. Georgia, seated beside the bed, chuckled under her breath. You snored too, she said, when you fell asleep in your applesauce yesterday. Issa giggled and buried her face in the dog's fur. In the hallway, Sawyer watched the scene through the glass, his hand resting unconsciously on the drawing in his coat pocket. For the first time in years, he felt like something broken was beginning to mend. The trees in Elder Spring had begun their slow surrender to autumn. Orange bled into gold, and gold dulled into brown. The air now carried the soft rode-off fallen leaves mixing with chimney smoke and the earthy perfume of rain-soaked bark. In room 208, the seasons did not change, at least not in the usual way. But for Issa, something warmer than weather had begun to settle beneath her skin. She sat upright on the hospital bed, a crayon clutched in one hand, her tongue pressed between her lips in quiet concentration. The paper in front of her was hospital form scrap, the back of a radiology requisition sheet, now reborn into color. She had drawn a house, not perfectly straight, but deliberate. A square window glowed yellow, smoke curled from the chimney in smooth spirals. Beside the house was a figure unmistakably canine with large ears and gentle eyes. Above it all, Isa had drawn a faint arc of cinnamon brown. When Georgia walked in that morning with her usual basket, Isa looked up and said, "It smells like this place." Georgia froze. She stepped closer, inspecting the child's work. Her fingers twitched slightly at the sight. The house was familiar, achingly so. It was her house, the little blue one with chipped white trim and a crooked mailbox. She had lived there since 1985. Claire had learned to ride her bike in that yard. The chimney still cracked smoke the way Ella had drawn it, and the tree beside it leaned at the same odd slant. Even the porch light, always left on. "That's my home," Georgia said, voice unsteady. Isa beamed. "It's in my dream every night. I think I live there. Or maybe I'm supposed to." Georgia didn't answer right away. She knelt beside the bed and brushed a loose hair from Isa's temple, something she hadn't done for anyone in half a decade. She glanced at Shadow, who lay curled beneath the window. He lifted his head briefly and let out Asmal huff, as if confirming what had just passed between them. Across the hallway, Ivy stirred for the first time since the night of the storm. Dr. Hampton had checked her hourly and now leaned against the door frame, arms crossed over his lab coat. He was a man not easily moved, but this morning he watched. As the little girl blinked into the world with a hesitant breath, her eyes wide and glassy, Ivy turned her head to the side where Georgia stood, having just stepped in with a glass of warm apple juice. "Mom?" Ivy whispered. It wasn't a declaration, only a question, blurred by fever or dream. But Georgia's breath caught all the same. She sat, the cup down without comment, and gently brushed a blanket higher over the girl's chest. Ivy blinked again and fell asleep once more, but the word lingered. Georgia walked out slowly and found Sawyer waiting at the end of the corridor, holding a manila envelope in one hand. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were soft. "You have Aminet?" he asked. They stepped into a side office once used by a pediatrician who had retired last spring. The room still smelled faintly of bubble gum and old carpet. Sawyer laid the envelope on the table and opened it. Inside was a photograph worn and slightly bent, the edges curled from years in a drawer. It showed two children, one girl, one boy, sitting on a blanket in a field. Between them was a younger version of Shadow, ears perked, tail curled around the boy's leg. "That's my daughter, June," Sawyer said quietly. "And your son, Caleb?" Georgia didn't speak for a long moment. She reached for the photo as if it might disappear. "They were friends?" she finally asked. "They were inseparable," Sawyer nodded. "That's how we met, remember?" She did now. Thaw time had buried it beneath years of avoidance. Georgia had once been Sawyer's neighbor. Their kids played together every summer until Caleb's family moved to California and Sawyer's life unraveled into grief. "I found this last night," Sawyer said. "Thought maybe it should come home." Georgia swallowed. "You never said she had passed." "No," he said. "Some stories are easier to leave unopened." Georgia nodded once, then carefully folded the photo back into the envelope and placed it in her purse. That afternoon, she returned home briefly to prepare the girl's favorite, the cinnamon twist bread Ula had timidly requested the day before. When she stepped inside her kitchen, a white envelope sat on the floor just under the mail slot. No stamp, just a seal from the Elder Springs Social Services Department. She opened it with a bread knife. It was short and cold, a warning letter. Because Georgia was a single retiree with no formal employment and no foster license, she would not qualify as a guardian without significant financial support or a co-sponsor. The letter read like a shutdown, masked in formal language. Georgia stared at it for a long time. Then she placed it beside Theovan and returned to kneading dough. Her hands, calloused and sure, worked rhythmically. She did not cry, but when the timer dinged, she forgot what she was baking. Back at the hospital, Sawyer found Ida sitting on the floor with Shadow, her fingers tangled in his fur. She looked up when he entered. "Shadow was in the picture," she said. He sat down beside her. "Yes, so he knew your daughter too." Sawyer nodded slowly. "Did she love him?" "She did," he said. "She said he listened better than most people." Issa looked down. "He listens to me too." For the rest of the afternoon, Issa hummed softly as she colored a new drawing. This one showed the same house, but this time 2 figures stood in the doorway. One was Shadow, the other was a tall woman holding a tray of something that smelled like comfort. Sawyer watched her quietly, knowing that in children's art, dreams always come first. The courthouse in Elder Spring stood at the far end of Main Street, a modest brick building with ivy creeping along its northern wall, and a weathered wooden door that creaked when opened too fast. It was the kind of place that saw more property disputes than people, more ennui about fences than families. But on this particular morning, it was filled with the quiet weight of something much deeper. Georgia Lynn stood in front of the small, Claims desk, her hands folded in front of her like she had when Claire first entered kindergarten, uncertain but trying to appear certain. She wore an Ivy coat over a sweater, frayed at the sleeves, and her hair tied into its usual braid, now flecked with strands of soft gray. In her purse were 2 drawings, one of a house with light pouring out of every window, and one off to stick. Figure girls standing beside a dog with round knowing eyes. The clerk handed her a packet. "Official denial from the foster board," he said, note unkindly. "You don't meet the financial threshold. No current employment, no secondary guardian, but there is an appeals process." "I've read it," she said. Behind her, footsteps echoed. Sawyer entered, dressed in full uniform, clean-cut and composed. Shadow walked beside him, harnessed but alert. The sight of them drew glances, not because of the badge, but because of what they represented, someone who never gave up on a stormy night. Sawyer spoke softly to Georgia. "They're not done listening." He handed her a folder. Inside was a stack of pages, signatures, statements, personal letters. Dr. Elroy Hampton had written that Georgia had shown instinctive maternal clarity and that the children had shown palpable emotional improvement in her care. The town librarian had contributed a letter recalling the time Georgia had paid the overdue school lunch balances for 6 children anonymously. Even Miss Marilyn Fry, who ran the bookstore and had never once let Georgia pay full price for coffee, wrote a note that ended, "Sometimes love is the only qualification that matters." And at the bottom of the last page was the signature of Sheriff Thomas Reed, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel and a handshake like iron. He was in his 60s, always wore brown leather boots, and carried with him the memory of a son lost to addiction. He had written only one sentence. She showed up when the state didn't. 3 weeks later, the judge presiding over the appeal, an arrow-faced woman named Judge Henley, known for her rigor and discipline, called Georgia back into the courtroom. Judge Henley had dark eyes that scanned everything as if waiting for flaws to reveal themselves. She had no children of her own, but she kept a ceramic owl on her bench, one that had belonged to her sister, who died young. Georgia stood beside Sawyer, who offered no words, only presence. "I have reviewed the file." Judge Henley said, "I cannot in good conscience place children in a household that does not meet state requirements, but I am also not blind to what I see." She tapped the folder. "In light of the compelling community support and under Section 12C of the Protective Emergency Act, I will grant temporary kinship guardianship status to Ms. Georgia Lynn for 90 days. You will be evaluated monthly, and a final hearing will be held at the end of that term. Do you understand?" Georgia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "Very well. The girls will be released to your care this afternoon, after court." Adjourned, Georgia stepped outside and sat on the courthouse bench beneath a rusted plaque. Sawyer didn't follow her immediately. He stayed back to sign transition paperwork. Shadow padded forward and sat at George's feet, tail sweeping once. "I didn't expect to win," she whispered. To him. Shadow didn't answer, of course, but he leaned his head against her knee and sighed as if to say, "Finally." That evening, as the sun dipped low across the hills behind Elder Spring Elementary, Sawyer stood at the edge of the schoolyard. The building was nothing extravagant, a series of beige portables clustered around a modest playground. But today, it glowed like something more. It was the girls' first day back to school. Georgia had ironed their clothes, Issa in a denim jacket and yellow tights, Ivy in a sky blue hoodie and canvas sneakers a size too big. Their backpacks were borrowed. Their pencils mismatched, but their smiles were real. Sawyer didn't go inside. He hadn't stepped into a school building since June died. The last time it had been for a teacher-parent meeting they never finished. But Shadow trotted forward without hesitation. The dog walked beside the girls all the way to the steps, then sat at the base of the railing and watched until they disappeared. Inside, one of the teachers, a woman in her 30s named Emily Hart, short and auburn-haired, warm but firm, bent down and scratched behind his ears. "Well, aren't you something?" she said. "You here for them?" Shadow blinked, then looked back once, toward the parking lot. Sawyer stood still, hands in his pockets. Emily nodded. Figured. Later that afternoon, when the girls came back out, they ran straight to him. First Ivy, then EA. They buried their hands in his fur, and he let them. Not just because he was loyal, because he had chosen them too. Sawyer stepped. Forward then, just a few paces. Georgia met him there. "Thank you," she said. "For what? For not giving up on them or me?" He smiled slightly. "I just followed the dog. The first true day of spring in Elder Spring did not come with trumpets of wild flowers or cinematic bursts of sun. It arrived humbly with a breeze that no longer bit, a sky that softened from pewter to porcelain, and a yard that smelled more like possibility than mold. In a small blue house on Birch Street, where lace curtains now fluttered openly in the windows, a quiet transformation had rooted itself deep and steady. Georgia Lynn stood in the kitchen, flour dusting the edge of her apron, her braid tucked loosely over one shoulder. The oven ticked softly behind her as 2 loaves of honey wheat breaded inside. On the counter, cinnamon buns cooled beside a tray of lemon wrap cookies. The aroma curled through the house like a hand reaching outward, welcoming anyone who stepped near. And now, more than ever, people did. Since being granted temporary custody, Georgia had begun baking not just for the girls, but for neighbors again. She sold what she could from a small hand-painted wooden stand in the yard, open 3 afternoons a week, and signaled by a tiny flag that Ella and Ivy helped paint. Ivy had insisted on drawing a smiling sun with roots instead of rays, which inspired. The name they all eventually agreed on, Sunroot Bakery. The name stuck. It matched the house, too. After some deliberation and hesitant brushstrokes, Georgia had painted the words Sunroot in white script just above the porch steps. It wasn't flashy, but it felt like truth. Outside, Sawyer Whitlock was on his knees beside the house, hammering. The final nails into Asmal's structure nestled beneath the eaves. A doghouse, sturdy and well-built, its roof made from reclaimed barnwood. He'd painted it a soft rust color with a nameplate above the entry that simply read, Shadow. The dog himself sat nearby, watching the construction like a supervisor on break. Sawyer, now in civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a faded gray flannel, stood and brushed sawdust from his sleeves. He was a man who rarely spoke more than necessary. But since the girls had moved in, his words had softened. So had the lines around his eyes. "Looks good, doesn't it?" he asked the dog. Shadow blinked in agreement and resumed his position by the step where the morning sun warmed his coat. Inside, Issa was hunched over the kitchen table, a box of crayons spilled beside her elbow, Her drawing showed a house with wide wings instead of a roof, 2 girls peeking from the windows, and a dog sitting in a sunbeam. Georgia leaned over and kissed the top of her head before returning to the oven. "Are those wings?" Georgia asked. "They help us fly," Isa answered matter-of-factly, "but only when it's warm enough to land again." Georgia smiled and didn't question it. That afternoon, the household gathered for the first birthday the girls had celebrated since their mother's passing. Ivy and Isa didn't know their exact birth date, only that it had been spring, sometime around when the leaves got baby green. So Georgia had picked April 12th. It felt right. She had gone to the general store and bought simple streamers and a pink tablecloth. Sawyer brought balloons, yellow and blue, the girls' favorite colors. Shadow, of course, supervised it all. Ivy insisted on tying a ribbon around his neck. He bore it with the patience of a saint. When Georgia brought out the cake, vanilla with peach filling, decorated in imperfect swirls of white and butter yellow, Isla whispered, "It smells like the porch in the dream." Sawyer lit the candles. The girls hesitated. "Make a wish," Georgia said. "We already got it," Ivy replied. Then quietly, "We got you." They blew out the candles together. Later, while everyone sat in the backyard on old picnic blankets and sipped lemonade, Isa quietly handed Sawyer a folded paper. It was the drawing from earlier. He unfolded it and stared at it a long while. Then, without a word, he took it inside and pinned it beneath a photo frame that had long been lonely on the hallway wall. A picture of June, mid-laugh, freckles absent, but brightness uncontained. The new drawing didn't replace the old. It added to it. A new note in a melody long paused. Georgia came up behind him as he stood looking. "She would have liked them," she said. "I think she already does." That evening, after the sun had dipped and the backyard had emptied of neighbors and laughter and cake crumbs, Ivy and Isa lay curled beneath a patchwork quilt in their room. The room still smelled faintly of cinnamon and sawdust, but now also of lavender from the sachets Georgia had placed in the drawers. Ivy reached over and took Isa's hand. "Do you think we were lucky?" she whispered. Isa shook her head gently. "We didn't get lucky." She turned toward the window where the breeze played lightly against the curtains. "We got found. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive with fanfare or thunder from the skies. They come wrapped in quiet mornings, warm bread, the steady heartbeat of a dog lying beside a child, or the gentle hands of someone who chooses to stay. This story isn't just about 2 girls who were saved. It's about the saving we can offer each other, the family we build when the world forgets us, and the home we create when we dare to love beyond bloodlines. Perhaps it wasn't luck. Perhaps it was grace, the kind that moves through people like Georgia, through dogs like Shadow, through every small act of kindness that stitches light into the torn edges of life. And maybe, just maybe, it was God's whisper, soft but certain, guiding them through the storm. In your own life, look for the sentiments, the neighbor who checks in, the stranger who holds a door, the child who needs more than words. You may be the miracle someone's been praying for. If this story moved you, please share it with someone you love. Leave a comment and let us know your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel to join us for more stories that remind us of what matters most. And may God bless you and your family with the kind of love that finds you when you least expect it, but need it the most.